When I checked my father's Alzheimer's medication, I was puzzled. The box said Reminal, but the pills inside looked different. When I showed them to the pharmacist, he said, "This is a memory-erasing drug." Nurse Sandra had been deliberately destroying my father's memory for 8 months. My name is Michael Johnson. I'm 52 years old, and I just discovered that the healthcare professional I trusted with my father's most vulnerable condition had been systematically poisoning his mind to steal his fortune. But what I learned about the scope of Sandra Williams' operation would prove that my father wasn't her first victim. Standing in the pharmacy at Walgreens on 5th Street, holding a small plastic bottle that contained the evidence of 8 months of systematic elder abuse, I felt my world shift completely. The pharmacist, a middle-aged man named Gary, who'd been working there for over 15 years, looked at me with genuine concern. "Sir, where did these pills come from?" he asked, examining the tablets I'd brought from my father's medication organizer. "From my father's memory care facility. His nurse said they were his prescribed Alzheimer's medication." Gary shook his head slowly. "These are definitely not Reminal. This is midazolam, a benzodiazepine that's used for sedation, and in some cases, to cause temporary amnesia before medical procedures. What would happen if someone took this regularly? Long-term use would cause severe memory impairment, confusion, and cognitive decline. It would essentially accelerate dementia symptoms." The implications hit me like a physical blow. For 8 months, I'd been watching my father's condition deteriorate much faster than his neurologist had predicted. I'd attributed it to the natural progression of Alzheimer's disease, never imagining that someone was deliberately making it worse. My father, William Johnson, was 78 years old and had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease 2 years earlier. He'd been a successful commercial real estate developer, building a portfolio worth approximately $4.8 million, over 40 years of careful investment and business development, when his condition progressed to the point where he could no longer safely live alone. I'd researched memory care facilities extensively before choosing Sunset Manor, a highly rated specialized facility that promised individualized care for patients with cognitive decline. Sandra Williams had been assigned as Dad's primary nurse. From the day he'd moved into Sunset Manor, she was 45 years old, had 15 years of experience in elder care, and came with excellent references from previous employers. "Your father will receive the best possible care," Sandra had assured me during our initial meeting. "I specialize in Alzheimer's patients, and I'll make sure he's comfortable and his condition is managed properly." Sandra seemed genuinely caring and professional. She was always well informed about Dad's condition, maintained detailed records of his daily activities, and appeared to have developed a caring relationship with him. "Your father is a sweet man," she'd tell me during my visits. "We have such nice conversations when he's having clear moments." But over the months following Dad's admission to Sunset Manor, I'd noticed that his clear moments were becoming increasingly rare. His neurologist, Dr. Patricia Chun, had been surprised by the rapid progression of his symptoms. "Alzheimer's typically progresses more gradually," Dr. Chun had explained during one of our consultations. "Your father's cognitive decline seems to be accelerating faster than we'd normally expect. Is that unusual?" "It can happen, but I'd like to review his medication regimen to make sure there are no interactions or side effects that might be contributing to the progression." That's what had prompted me to check Dad's medications more carefully. I'd wanted to bring Dr. Chun a complete list of everything he was taking, including dosages and timing. The discovery at the pharmacy changed everything I thought I knew about my father's care and Sandra's motivations. I immediately called Dr. Chun's office and explained what the pharmacist had found. "Mr. Johnson, if what you're telling me is accurate, this represents serious medical malpractice and quite possibly criminal elder abuse," Dr. Chun said. You need to contact Adult Protective Services immediately, and we need to get your father. Proper medical evaluation. What kind of damage could this have caused? Memory-erasing drugs can cause permanent cognitive damage, especially in someone who already has Alzheimer's. The combination could accelerate brain deterioration significantly. That afternoon, I drove to Sunset Manor to confront Sandra and demand an explanation. But when I arrived, I was told that Sandra had called in sick and wouldn't be working for the rest of the week. Is there something I can help you with? Asked Janet, the facility administrator. I need to speak with you privately about my father's care. In Janet's office, I explained what I'd discovered about the medication substitution. Janet's reaction was immediate shock, followed by professional concern. Mr. Johnson, if what you're alleging is true, this represents a serious breach of our care standards and potentially criminal activity. We need to involve our medical director immediately. I want to see all of my father's medical records, and I want to know exactly who has had access to his medications. Janet began pulling files while calling Dr. Robert Martinez, Sunset Manor's medical director. When Dr. Martinez arrived 30 minutes later, his review of Dad's records revealed several concerning patterns. According to these charts, your father's prescribed medications haven't changed in months, Dr. Martinez explained. But his behavioral observations show symptoms consistent with someone receiving sedatives or memory-suppressing drugs. How is that possible? Someone would have had to substitute his actual medications with different drugs while maintaining the appearance that he was receiving proper treatment. Who would have access to do that? His primary nurse would have the most direct access to his daily medications. Dr. Martinez immediately ordered new prescriptions for Dad's actual Alzheimer's medications and arranged for them to be administered directly by pharmacy staff rather than through the nursing staff. We're also implementing additional oversight of all medication distribution until we can determine the scope of this situation, he said. That evening, I sat with Dad in his room, watching him struggle to recognize me. The man who had taught me to ride a bike, helped me with homework, and built a successful business through intelligence and hard work, was now confused about basic facts like his own name. Do I know you? He asked, looking at me with a blank expression that had become heartbreakingly familiar. I'm Michael, Dad. I'm your son. I have a son? Knowing that his confusion might be the result of deliberate medication tampering rather than just disease progression made the conversation even more devastating. Over the following week, as Dad began receiving his correct medications, I started investigating Sandra's background and discovered that my father wasn't her first victim. Working with a private investigator named David Torres, who specialized in elder abuse cases, I learned that Sandra Williams had a pattern of targeting wealthy, elderly patients in memory care facilities. Sandra Williams isn't even her real name, Torres explained during our first meeting. She's actually Sandra Mitchell, and she's worked at 4 different memory care facilities over the past 6 years. What happened at the other facilities? At each location, wealthy patients in her care experienced rapid cognitive decline, and several made significant changes to their wills or financial arrangements shortly before their deaths. How many patients are we talking about? At least 7 that I've been able to document. The total value of estates that were redirected to Sandra or her associates is over $12 million. Torres showed me documentation of Sandra's previous employers and the suspicious patterns that had emerged at each facility. In most cases, families had attributed their loved one's rapid decline to the natural progression of dementia, never suspecting that the decline was being artificially accelerated. The most disturbing case was Harold Peterson in San Diego, Torres continued. Wealthy widower, early-stage Alzheimer's. Within 6 months of Sandra becoming his primary nurse, he'd changed his will to leave everything to a charitable foundation that turned out to be controlled by Sandra. What happened to Mr. Peterson? He died of what appeared to be complications from his dementia. But his family became suspicious when they learned about the will change and had his body exhumed for autopsy. What did they find? Elevated levels of memory-suppressing drugs and evidence of long-term poisoning with substances that would accelerate cognitive decline. The investigation into Sandra's activities expanded rapidly once law enforcement became involved. Adult Protective Services, working with the FBI's elderfraud task force, discovered that Sandra had been operating a sophisticated scheme that targeted vulnerable elderly patients in multiple states. The method was always similar. Sandra would gain employment at upscale memory care facilities, identify patients with substantial assets and limited family oversight, then begin a gradual process of cognitive manipulation designed to make them compliant with financial changes that benefited her. She's been very careful about selection, FBI agent Sarah Chan explained during one of our interviews. She targets patients whose families live far away or visit infrequently, patients who have substantial assets but limited daily contact with financial advisors or attorneys. How does she actually change their wills? She works with a network of corrupt attorneys and notaries who specialize in elder financial abuse. They visit the patients when they're most confused and vulnerable, often immediately after Sandra has given them extra doses of memory-suppressing drugs. The evidence against Sandra was overwhelming. Hidden cameras that investigators installed in Dad's room after obtaining warrants captured her replacing his legitimate medications with counterfeit pills, designed to increase confusion and memory loss. They also recorded her coaching Dad too, signed documents that he clearly didn't understand, telling him they were medical forms when they were actually financial power of attorney, agreements that would have given her control over his assets. Your father is actually quite fortunate, Agent Chun told me. You discovered the medication tampering before Sandra had time to complete the financial manipulation phase of her scheme. What was she planning to do? Based on documents we found in her apartment, she was planning to have your father transfer ownership of his commercial properties to a shell company she controlled, supposedly as part of a tax avoidance strategy that a financial advisor had recommended. The financial documents that investigators recovered from Sandra's apartment revealed the scope of her criminal enterprise. She had detailed files on dozens of elderly patients, including comprehensive financial profiles, family contact information, and strategic plans for asset extraction. Dad's file contained appraisals of his real estate holdings, copies of his existing will, and draft documents that would have transferred most of his wealth to various entities controlled by Sandra's criminal network. She had it all planned out, Torres explained. Your father would have signed over his properties while in a drugged, confused state, believing he was just updating his medical paperwork. The trial that followed was extensive and received significant media attention as details of Sandra's multi-state elder abuse operation became public. She was ultimately convicted on dozens of charges including elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Her criminal network included 5 other healthcare workers, 3 attorneys, 2 notaries, and several financial advisors who had been facilitating similar schemes in different states. The total value of assets that had been stolen from elderly victims exceeded $35 million, making it one of the largest elder financial abuse cases in federal law enforcement history. Sandra was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Her accomplices received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. But for the families of her victims, the legal victory provided only limited comfort. Most of the stolen assets had been moved offshore or hidden in complex financial structures that made recovery difficult. Dad's recovery from the medication tampering was partial but significant. Once he began receiving proper Alzheimer's treatment again, his cognitive function improved noticeably, though the months of deliberate memory suppression had caused some permanent damage. The human brain has remarkable resilience, Dr. Chun explained, but sustained exposure to memory-erasing drugs can cause lasting harm, especially in someone who already has dementia. Dad regained enough cognitive function to understand what had happened to him and to participate in Sandra's prosecution. His testimony during the trial was heartbreaking, but crucial in establishing the deliberate nature of her crimes. She told me the pills would help me remember, he said during his court appearance, but they made me forget everything. She made me forget my own son. The Sunset Manor facility implemented comprehensive reforms following the investigation, including external monitoring of all medication distribution and mandatory background checks that extended beyond standard employment verification. We trusted. Our employee screening process, Janet, the administrator, admitted. But Sandra had been very sophisticated about creating false references and hiding her criminal history. The case also led to statewide legislation requiring additional oversight of medication management in memory care facilities and criminal background checks for all healthcare workers with access to vulnerable populations. For our family, the experience fundamentally changed how we approached Dad's care. We moved him to a different facility with more transparent oversight systems and arranged for independent monitoring of his medical treatment. Dad lived for 3 more years after Sandra's conviction. While his Alzheimer's continued to progress, the rate of decline returned to what Dr. Chun considered normal for his condition. Without the medication tampering, your father was able to maintain much better quality of life than we initially feared. She explained. Sandra's intervention could have killed him much sooner. During his final years, Dad had periods of clarity where he could remember what Sandra had done to him and express gratitude that we'd discovered her scheme in time. I thought I was just getting old and forgetful, he said during one of our last meaningful conversations. I didn't know someone was making it worse on purpose. The financial impact on our family was significant but manageable. Dad's estate, which Sandra had planned to steal, remained intact and was ultimately distributed according to his original will. But the emotional impact of knowing that someone had deliberately accelerated his cognitive decline for personal gain was devastating and long-lasting. Elder abuse is often invisible, Agent Chun explained during a victim impact presentation she gave after the trial. Family members see their loved ones declining and assume it's natural aging or disease progression. They don't consider that someone might be deliberately causing harm. The case also revealed how vulnerable elderly people become when their families assume that professional caregivers can be trusted without verification or oversight. Sandra was able to operate for years because families trusted the system, Torres said. They assumed that licensed healthcare workers in reputable facilities were automatically safe and ethical. 3 years after Sandra's conviction, I received a call from Agent Chun informing me that additional victims had been identified in other states where Sandra had worked before coming to our area. We're still finding families who had loved ones in her care, she said. Your father's case was crucial in establishing the pattern that helped us identify other victims. The final count of Sandra's victims was 23 elderly patients across 6 states. The total financial impact exceeded $50 million when accounting for estate assets that were stolen, medical costs for treating drug-induced complications, and legal expenses for families seeking justice. But the human cost was immeasurable. Families had watched their loved ones suffer accelerated cognitive decline, believing it was natural disease progression, never knowing that someone was deliberately making their conditions worse. Sandra's scheme had been particularly cruel because it exploited not just financial vulnerability, but the most fundamental trust that families place in healthcare providers, the belief that medical professionals will do no harm. Looking back, there were warning signs that I missed or misinterpreted. Dad's unusually rapid decline, his confusion about medications, his occasional references to feeling drugged that I attributed to normal dementia symptoms, The most painful realization was that for 8 months, every visit with Dad had been shadowed by Sandra's deliberate manipulation of his condition. His confusion, his inability to recognize me, his apparent personality changes, much of it had been artificially induced. Elderabuse is one of the most underreported crimes in America. Agent Chun said during a conference presentation about the case, perpetrators count on the fact that victims often can't advocate for themselves, and that families trust healthcare systems to protect their loved ones. Sandra's conviction brought justice, but it also highlighted how many elderly people might be suffering similar abuse without anyone knowing. The investigation led to reforms in multiple states, but the fundamental vulnerability remains. The most important lesson I learned was that vigilance and verification are essential when entrusting loved ones to professional care providers, especially when those loved ones can't advocate for themselves. Trust in healthcare professionals is important, but blind trust can be dangerous when substantial assets and vulnerable people are involved. Dad's memory of Sandra's abuse faded as his natural Alzheimer's progression continued, which was perhaps a mercy. But my memory of discovering that someone had been deliberately poisoning his mind for months remains sharp and serves as a permanent reminder that evil sometimes wears a nurse's uniform and speaks with a caring voice. The woman who promised to provide compassionate care for my father's most vulnerable condition had actually been exploiting that vulnerability to steal his fortune and accelerate his cognitive decline. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones we pay to protect, the people we love most.